Is your farm covered under the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule? Find out in this video by the University of Hawaii at Manoa College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources Farm Food Safety Team and the Hawaii Department of Agriculture. The Food Safety Modernization Act, referred to as FSMA, was passed in 2011 and is the most sweeping reform of our food safety laws since the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. FSMA aims to shift our approach to food safety from reactive to proactive by preventing contamination to ensure our food supply is safe. The Food and Drug Administration has developed 7 rules under FSMA. The Produce Safety Rule, one of these 7 rules, is the mandatory federal rule concerning how produce is grown, harvested, packed, and held to prevent foodborne illness outbreaks. Some farms may be exempt from this rule, but all growers should understand and practice farm food safety. To help determine if you are covered by the Produce Safety Rule, we will go through a few questions. As we review these questions, think about your operation and how these may apply. What kind of operation are you running? Under the Produce Safety Rule, you could be considered a primary production farm, secondary activities farm, or farm mix-type facility. We'll go through these 3 definitions under the Produce Safety Rule to help you determine what type of operation you have. A primary production farm operates in one general area but may include multiple non-contiguous parcels, with the principal focus of growing or harvesting crops. These operations may pack and hold raw agricultural commodities in their raw or natural states. This can include racks grown on that farm and racks supplied from other farms. These operations may dry or dehydrate racks to create a distinct product without further processing and artificially ripen racks. They may manufacture or process food provided that all food is consumed on that farm or another farm under the same management. A secondary activities farm is not located on a primary production farm and is majority owned by a primary production farm operator or multiple primary production farm operators together. This type of farm is devoted to harvesting, packing, and/or holding racks provided that the primary production farm grows, harvests, or raises the majority of the produce handled by the secondary activities farm. A secondary activities farm may also conduct additional activities of a primary production farm. An example of a secondary activities farm is a processing or packing co-op. What if I meet the FDA farm requirements but also perform activities on food that are not listed in the definitions mentioned in the previous slides? If you make processed foods on the farm and conduct farming activities, your operation likely can be classified as either a retail food establishment or a farm mix-type facility. A retail food establishment is a business that manufactures foods and sells more than half of those products directly to consumers, including through on-premises sales, farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, roadside stands, online, and other direct marketing platforms. FSMA does not apply to retail food establishments, but retail food establishments in Hawaii are subject to Hawaii Department of Health regulations. If less than half of your processed food sales are direct to consumers, you are likely operating a farm mix-type facility. A farm mix-type facility must register with the FDA, and the food processing done on farm may be subject to at least portions of FSMA's preventive controls for human food rule. Are you harvesting, packing, and holding racks? Harvesting, packing, and holding are activities performed on racks to remove them from the field and prepare them for storage or distribution. Examples of these activities include separating the edible portion of the crop from the plant, field coring, trimming or removing outer leaves, stems, roots, tops, and husks, washing, sorting, grading, shelling, curing, drying or dehydrating that does not create a distinct commodity, cooling and hydro-cooling, weighing, packaging, labeling, and stickering, bunching, mixing different intact racks in a container, repacking, waxing, using pesticides in wash water, and loading for transportation. Let's take a look at specific examples of the distinction between racks and processed foods. Whole heads of lettuce are racks. However, once chopped into smaller pieces, they are no longer considered racks. Chopped lettuce is a processed food. Whole macadamia nuts are racks. They are no longer racks once ground into macadamia nut butter. Macadamia nut butter is a processed food. Fresh guavas are racks. If they are processed into guava juice, they are no longer racks. Guava juice is a processed food. Fresh papayas are racks, but they are no longer racks once irradiated. Irradiated papayas are processed foods. What if your produce operation only performs the packing and holding activities, but is not located on a primary production farm and is not majority owned by a farmer or farmers? Non-farm businesses that pack, hold, and store racks may be subject to the FSMA preventive controls for human food rule. What produce is covered under the produce safety rule? This is a non-exhaustive list, meaning the list does not include everything that could be identified as a rack. All these listed crops are covered under the produce safety rule. Produce not covered under the produce safety rule includes that which is rarely consumed raw, produced for personal or on-farm consumption, or not a raw agricultural commodity. The rule does not cover the crops on this exhaustive list because they are rarely consumed raw. If your crop is not listed here, it must be considered a covered crop. The produce safety rule applies only to farms or farm mix-type facilities with more than $25,000, adjusted for inflation in average annual value of all produce sold during the previous 3-year period, including covered and not covered produce. This includes all produce sold, not just produce covered under the rule. These sales include produce you purchased or obtained from another entity and resold to customers. Produce sold at farmers markets, to grocery stores, directly to consumers, or online. Produce sold by a third party on your behalf, such as when a cooperative sells your produce and returns the proceeds to you after the sale, and retail sales, wholesale sales, interstate sales, and interstate sales, including produce offered for import to the U.S. or exported from the U.S. For example, to calculate whether your farm is above or below the income threshold for the 2022 calendar year, calculate the average annual value of gross produce sales in 2021, 2020, and 2019 and compare that value to the inflation-adjusted cutoff from the FDA. Now let's go through an example so you can better understand how to determine if you are subject to the produce safety rule. A farm is performing a calculation in 2022 to determine whether it meets the income threshold for the current year. The farm would use its sales data for the preceding 3 years. In those years, the farm's sales consisted of $100,000 in live cattle, $50,000 in seaweed, $20,000 in tomatoes, and $1,000 in asparagus in 2019. $150,000 in live cattle, $25,000 in seaweed, $40,000 in tomatoes, and $1,500 in asparagus in 2020, and $150,000 in live cattle, $60,000 in dent corn, $10,000 in tomatoes, and $1,000 in asparagus in 2021. The live cattle, seaweed, and dent corn are not produce, so sales of these commodities are not included in the calculations. While asparagus is not covered produce under the rule, both asparagus and tomatoes are produce, so sales of these commodities are included in the calculations. The farm sells the tomatoes and asparagus to retail customers through its farm stand and sells some tomatoes to another farmer, who then sells them to a wholesaler. Retail and wholesale sales must be counted, so all of the farm's tomato and asparagus sales are included in the calculations. Total produce sales for each year to be included in the calculations are $21,000 in 2019, $41,500 in 2020, and $11,000 in 2021. The 3-year average of produce sales is $24,500. The 2019 to 2021 3-year average inflation adjusted cutoff obtained from the FDA website is $29,245. This farm is not subject to the produce safety rule because $24,500 is less than the cutoff for the 2022 year. The produce safety rule focuses on preventing microbial contamination and reducing foodborne illness associated with fresh produce. If your farm is covered by the produce safety rule, you must comply with the requirements in each section of the rule. The content of this video was adapted from the 2019 webinar series for growers, developed by Luisette F. Castro. If you have questions about whether your farm is covered or you would like more information about the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, contact the HDOA Hawaii Produce Safety Program or the CTAR Farm Food Safety Team.